Eben Byers had everything: a Pittsburgh steel fortune, a mansion, racehorses, a national amateur golf championship. So when a doctor recommended a tonic for a nagging arm injury, he could afford the very best. And what he was sold was a patent medicine called Radithor, radium, dissolved in distilled water, in a small glass bottle. He loved it. He said it made him feel wonderful. Over roughly 3 years, he drank something on the order of 1,400 bottles of it, sent cases to his friends as gifts, and gave it to his racehorses. Then his teeth began falling out. Then his jawbone. Surgeons removed most of his upper and lower jaw, and holes opened in his skull. He died in 1932 and was buried in a coffin lined with lead, where his bones remain radioactive to this day. This is the history of radium. The most chilling detail of Eben Byers' death is not the jaw. It is that he never blamed the tonic. Right to the end, by the accounts of those who examined him, Byers believed Radithor had done him good. He had felt energetic, he had felt young. That was the entire promise of the product, and for a while, the promise seemed to be delivering. What he could not know, and what almost nobody knew, was that every bottle was depositing something in his skeleton that would never come out. By the time federal investigators came to interview him, he was in an appalling state. One investigator's account of the visit became famous in the history of American drug regulation. He described a man whose head was wrapped in bandages, who had lost most of his jaw, who could barely speak, and yet who still had bottles of the tonic close at hand. Byers' body was, quite literally, dissolving around the thing he believed was saving him. A newspaper headline of the period reportedly captured the whole horror in a single dry line, saying that the radium water had worked fine right up until the moment his jaw came off. That grim joke went around the country, and it did something that years of scientific warnings had failed to do. It made wealthy, comfortable, ordinary people understand that the glowing miracle they had been buying might be killing them. Because that is the thing about radium that separates it from almost every other poison in this story. Nobody forced it on Eben Byers. Nobody hid it from him or slipped it into his water supply. He sought it out. He paid a premium for it. He recommended it to his friends. He wanted it inside his body because he had been told by advertisements and by his own physician that it would make him healthier and younger and stronger. To understand how an intelligent man could drink 1,400 bottles of radioactive water on purpose, you have to understand what radium meant to the world in the first decades of the 20th century. Radium was discovered in 1898 by Marie and Pierre Curie, who refined it out of tons of pitchblende ore in a freezing shed in Paris and named it for the way it radiated. That story has been told on this channel before, so we will leave it there and go straight to what mattered to everyone else. What the world decided radium was. And what the world decided was that radium was quite possibly the most extraordinary substance ever found. Start with the money. Radium was, gram for gram, among the most expensive substances on Earth. Extracting a single gram required processing many tons of ore through an exhausting chemical process, and the price reflected that scarcity. At various points, a gram of radium cost more than $100,000 in the money of the day, a sum that would buy several substantial houses. Nations tracked their radium supplies. When a national fundraising campaign in America bought a single gram of radium to present to Marie Curie, it was front-page news. This was not a chemical, it was treasure. And then there was the glow. Radium does something no ordinary material does. It produces light and warmth continuously, from itself, with no fuel, no fire, and no visible cause. A speck of radium salt in a dark room gives off a faint, eerie, blue-green shine that never goes out. It is also perceptibly warm to the touch, warmer than its surroundings, for no reason a person in 1900 could see. It sat there in the dark, glowing and warm, apparently forever. Put yourself in that moment before anyone properly understood what radioactivity was. Here is a substance that pours out light and heat from nothing, endlessly, without being consumed. What would you call that? The vocabulary available at the time reached for exactly the words you would expect. Newspapers and advertisers described radium as liquid sunshine, as bottled energy, as a kind of captured vitality. It looked, for all the world, like life force made visible, a piece of pure energy that a person could hold in their hand. And if a substance contains boundless energy and you are a person who feels tired or old or unwell, the logic writes itself. Get that energy inside you. Drink the sunshine. Absorb the vitality. It is not stupid. It is, given what was known, almost intuitive. There was also just enough real medicine in the picture to make the whole thing credible, and this is essential to understanding what followed. Doctors had discovered early that radium's radiation destroys living tissue and that it destroys some tumors faster than it destroys healthy flesh. Placing radium next to certain cancers could shrink them. That was genuine, and it was the beginning of a real medical discipline, the ancestor of radiation therapies still saving lives today. So radium was not a pure fraud. It was a substance that could visibly, measurably fight cancer in the hands of physicians in hospitals. Doctors sealed tiny amounts of it into needles and tubes and placed them directly against or inside tumors. And patients with growths that had been considered hopeless sometimes watched them shrink. Hospitals across Europe and America acquired radium at enormous expense and guarded it like bullion. And the technique they were developing, placing a radiation source directly at the site of a tumor, is still practiced today under the name brachytherapy, though with safer materials. Radium's medical reputation was earned. That legitimacy is precisely what gave cover to everything that came next. If it can cure cancer, people reasoned, imagine what a little of it might do for your energy, your complexion, your digestion, your vigor. And there was no clear public line in those years between the physician placing a sealed radium needle beside a tumor and the salesman offering a bottle of radium water for tired blood. Both were radium, both were modern, both were science. And here is the thing nobody knew. The fact that turns this entire story from a fad into a catastrophe. Radium sits in the same family of elements as calcium. Chemically, the body cannot really tell the difference. So when radium enters a human being, whether swallowed in a tonic or absorbed through the mouth, the body does not treat it as a foreign poison to be flushed out. It treats it as a building material. It carries the radium to the skeleton and lays it down in the bone, exactly as it would with the calcium from a glass of milk. And there it stays, locked in the bone next to the marrow, irradiating the surrounding tissue from the inside, every second of every day, for the rest of that person's life and long after. Nobody was thinking about that in 1925. They were thinking about the glow. And an entire industry was about to be built on the promise of putting it inside people. What followed was one of the strangest consumer manias in modern history, and the sheer breadth of it is difficult to convey. Radithor, the tonic that killed Eben Byers, was only one product among hundreds. It was made by a company run by a man who called himself a doctor, but had no legitimate medical degree, and it was sold as a cure for well over 100 ailments, promising renewed energy, restored vitality, and a return of youthful vigor. It was expensive, which was part of its appeal. It was the kind of thing a man like Byers could be seen drinking. But radium was not only for the rich, and it was not only swallowed. It went into nearly everything that touched the body. There was radium toothpaste. In Germany, a brand called Doramad was sold with the promise that its radioactive ingredient would strengthen the gums and give teeth a brilliant shine, its advertising boasting about the invigorating rays going to work in the mouth. People brushed with it twice a day, believing the tingle of radioactivity was cleaning their teeth. There were radium cosmetics. In France, a line called Radium sold face cream, powder, and beauty products containing radioactive ingredients, marketed with a striking image of a woman's face illuminated in the dark, promising to restore the skin's youthful glow. Women massaged it into their faces at the dressing table before bed. There were radium bath salts to soak in, radium hair tonics to rub into the scalp against baldness, radium soap, radium chocolate, sold in Germany as a rejuvenating treat. Radium-infused bread was attempted. There were pads and belts and compresses to strap against aching joints, and suppositories and pendants to wear against the chest so the radiation could work on the body all day long. And there was a product sold to men worried about their virility, a radium-lined athletic support worn against the genitals, marketed on the promise that it would restore male vigor. There is a temptation to laugh at that, and the laugh dies as soon as you follow it through. Men bought that device because they were anxious and unhappy and hoped it would fix something in their lives. And what they did was hold a radioactive source against the most sensitive tissue in their bodies, all day, for months. The absurdity is not the joke. The absurdity is what makes it unbearable. For those with money, there were radium clinics and spas. Wealthy patients paid substantial fees for radium injections, drank radioactive water at resorts, and inhaled radon gas in sealed rooms called emanatoria, sitting in the dark breathing radioactivity as a health treatment. Some spas built their entire business on advertising the radioactivity of their springs, which was regarded not as a warning but as the main attraction. And radium was fun. The glow made it irresistible as a novelty. Luminous paint containing radium went onto watch faces, clock hands, light switches, gun sights, doorknobs, and instrument dials. It went on to children's toys and dolls' eyes and fishing lures. There were glowing theatrical costumes. Some products were sold specifically so that children could watch things shine in a dark bedroom. There is one more wrinkle to the craze, and it is bleakly funny in a way that says everything about the era. Radium was so staggeringly expensive that a great many products advertising it contained little or none at all. Manufacturers slapped the word onto soaps, creams, and tonics purely because it sold, and inspectors testing these goods often found no measurable radioactivity whatsoever, which produced an almost unbearable irony. The customers who were cheated were the lucky ones. The people who got what they paid for, who bought the real thing from an honest supplier, like the makers of Radithor, were the ones it killed. In the radium boom, fraud was the safest product on the shelf. None of this was hidden. That is what marks radium out. There was no cover-up, no suppressed study, no industry burying its own data. The radioactivity was the selling point. Printed in large letters on the front of the box, the manufacturers were not concealing the dangerous ingredient. They were charging extra for it. But not everyone who came into contact with radium was buying a luxury. And while the wealthy sipped tonics and dabbed on face cream in doses that were, in the scheme of things, relatively small, there was a group of people absorbing it in far greater quantities, for a wage of pennies a dial. They were young women, and they were painting watches. The work began during the First World War and boomed afterward. Luminous watch dials were in enormous demand, first for soldiers and then for the consumer market, and painting the tiny numerals required a fine brush and a steady hand. Companies hired young women, some barely out of school, and taught them a technique to keep the brush tip sharp. Draw it to a point between the lips, dip, paint, and repeat. Lip, dip, paint. Hundreds of times a shift. The women were told the material was harmless, and because it was beautiful, they played with it. They painted their fingernails with it for fun and their teeth so they would glow when they went out dancing. The dust settled in their hair and on their clothes so that they shone faintly, walking home in the dark, and people in town called them the ghost girls. The consequences began appearing within a few years because radium goes into the bone. It attacked them from the inside out. Their teeth loosened and fell out. Their jaws became infected and began to crumble, a condition so characteristic it came to be known as radium jaw. Their bones grew brittle, and some broke under ordinary movement. Tumors grew. Women in their 20s died in terrible pain. The first great scandal broke in New Jersey in the 1920s, where a group of dying dial painters fought their employer in a legal battle that made national headlines, forced the danger into public view, and helped establish that a worker could hold a company responsible for a disease it had caused. That fight has been covered on this channel before, and it deserves its fame. But here is what most people do not know, and it is the part of this story that should genuinely disturb you. It changed nothing where it mattered, because while those women were dying in New Jersey and their case was in the newspapers, the very same work was continuing with the very same technique at a plant in a small town in Illinois. And the women there were told not to worry. The town was Ottawa, Illinois, and the company was Radium Dial. Local women, many of them from families that had lived in the area for generations, took jobs painting dials because it was clean, respectable, well-paid work for a young woman in a small town. They were taught to point the brushes with their lips, exactly as their counterparts in New Jersey had been. And this was happening after the New Jersey scandal was public. When the Ottawa women grew anxious about the reports coming out of the East, the company reassured them. According to accounts of the period, Radium Dial ran a newspaper advertisement in the local paper, explicitly reassuring the community that nothing of the sort could happen there, and told the women their work was safe. The company also, at various points, ran medical tests on its workers and did not tell them what the results showed, so the women kept working. And then, one by one, they began to fall ill in precisely the same way. It is worth understanding what that meant in a town like Ottawa. These were not anonymous workers in a distant city. They were neighbors, sisters, and school friends. And the plant was one of the best employers a young woman in that town could hope for. When they began to sicken, some of the community turned against them rather than against the company because the company was the payroll. Accounts from the period describe ill women being treated as hypochondriacs or as troublemakers threatening local jobs, and some found themselves shunned by people they had known all their lives. They were dying, and they were being asked, in effect, to die quietly. One of them was Catherine Donahue. Catherine Wolfe Donahue had worked at the plant through her early 20s. She was a small, devout woman, married, with 2 young children. By her early 30s, she was desperately ill, limping badly, in constant pain, her hip disintegrating, wasting away until she weighed well under 70 pounds. Pieces of her jawbone came away in her hand. She had been let go from the plant when her limp became noticeable and her appearance began to trouble the other workers. She and a small group of other stricken Ottawa women decided to sue. They were by then dying. They had very little money, faced a company that fought them at every turn, and struggled even to find a lawyer willing to take the case. What followed was a legal grind that stretched across years and multiple appeals, with the company contesting every ruling. Catherine Donahue was too sick to travel to the hearings, so in 1938 her testimony was taken in her own home, from her bed, with the proceedings held in her front room. Photographs from that period show a skeletal woman propped on pillows describing what had been done to her, while lawyers stood around her bed. She reportedly kept fragments of her own jawbone in a small box and presented them as evidence of what the work had done. She won. The ruling went in the women's favor, and the company's appeals were exhausted one after another all the way up. Catherine Donahue died in July of 1938 at the age of 35, days after learning that the final appeal had failed and that she and the other women had prevailed. She did not live to see any real benefit from it, and this is the beat that makes the Ottawa story matter as much as the famous one. The first scandal had happened, the warnings had been printed in national newspapers, the science was known, and a company simply carried on with the same practice in a different state, told its workers there was nothing to fear, and poisoned a second wave of young women who had every opportunity to be protected, and were not. But something did come out of it, and it is one of the strangest legacies in the history of medicine. The bodies of these women were, in the coldest scientific sense, an irreplaceable record. Radium has a half-life of roughly 1,600 years, which means the radium laid into their bones in 1920 was still overwhelmingly present decades later, and would be present for centuries to come. Their skeletons carried a precise, permanent measurement of exactly how much radiation a human being had absorbed, and their medical histories showed exactly what that dose had done. So they were studied. For decades, researchers tracked the surviving dial painters, monitoring their health, measuring the radioactivity still emanating from their bodies. A federal research center was established that followed these cases over many years, and in some instances, remains were exhumed, with family consent, so that the radium in the bones could be measured directly. Women who had been poisoned as teenagers spent the rest of their long lives being measured, some of them still giving readings on instruments half a century after they last held a brush. And from that data came numbers, actual defensible figures on how much radiation the human body can absorb before the damage begins, derived from real people whose exposure and outcomes were both precisely known. Those figures arrived just as the world was building its first atomic industry, as the Manhattan Project and the nuclear age that followed put workers to work handling radioactive material at enormous scale. The safety standards used to protect them drew directly on what had been learned from the dial painter's bones. The limits that kept those workers alive were written, in a real sense, in the skeletons of young women who had been told to point their brushes with their lips. They were never warned. Their suffering became the warning for everybody else. And here the loop from the beginning of this story closes, because everything in it follows from the same simple fact. Radium behaves like calcium. It goes into bone, and it stays there, and it keeps radiating. That is why Eben Byers lost his jaw drinking a luxury tonic in a mansion, and it is why Catherine Donahue lost hers, painting numerals in a factory for pennies. The rich man swallowed it as a treat, and the working woman absorbed it as a job, and the element did not distinguish between them at all. It went to the bone in both, and it did the same thing. The craze died fast once Eben Byers did. His death in 1932 was widely reported, and the details were too gruesome to argue with. Radithor's manufacturer was pursued by federal authorities, sales of radium tonics collapsed, and the market for radioactive health products drained away over a few years as the public finally connected the glow with the graves. It also left a permanent mark on the law. At the time, American regulators had shockingly little power over products like Radithor. The tonic was not technically mislabeled. It genuinely contained the radium it claimed to contain, and under the rules of the day, a product that was exactly what it said it was could be very difficult to touch, however lethal. Byers' death, alongside other patent medicine disasters of the era, became part of the pressure that produced the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. A law that dramatically expanded the government's authority to demand that products be shown safe before being sold. Modern drug safety regulation in the United States owes a genuine debt to a golf champion who drank himself to death out of a small glass bottle. But radium itself did not go away because radium cannot go away. That 1,600-year half-life means that essentially every gram ever refined is still, in radioactive terms, almost entirely intact. It is in landfills, it is in old industrial sites, it is in graves, including in a lid-lined coffin in Pennsylvania. And a surprising amount of it is simply lying around in ordinary places. Radium dial clocks and watches from the 1920s and 30s turn up constantly in antique shops, estate sales, and attics, and they are still radioactive. The glow has faded because the phosphor that produced the light wears out long before the radium does, but the radium is still there and still active. Old aircraft instruments, military compasses, and gauges with luminous dials are collected and traded. Radiation safety authorities in several countries have issued guidance about handling them, particularly warning against opening or breaking them, because the real hazard is the flaking paint, becoming dust that can be inhaled or swallowed. Every so often, the past resurfaces more dramatically. Sites of former radium processing and dial painting plants have required serious environmental cleanup decades after closing, with contaminated soil removed by the truckload. In some places, contaminated material from the radium era was used as fill-in construction and turned up years later beneath ordinary buildings and homes, requiring remediation. The industry has been gone for the better part of a century, and it is still being dug out of the ground. And then there is the final turn, the one that gives this story a strange kind of symmetry. Radium is used in medicine today, not the way it was in the spas, but in a precise, modern form, a treatment using a specific isotope, radium-223, approved for certain patients with advanced prostate cancer that has spread to the bones. And the reason it works is exactly the property that made it so lethal a century ago. Because radium behaves like calcium, the body carries it straight to areas of active bone growth, which is precisely where these tumors are. The radiation it emits travels only a very short distance. So it damages the cancer immediately around it while sparing more distant tissue. The element seeks out bone, deposits itself there, and irradiates what it finds. That is the identical mechanism that destroyed Catherine Donahue's jaw and Eben Byers' skull. Same element, same behavior, same destination in the body. The only difference is the dose, the isotope, and the fact that we now aim it deliberately at something we want destroyed, instead of feeding it to a healthy man in a bottle and telling him it will make him feel young. So step back and look at the whole of it. An element that pours out light and heat from nothing, discovered in a Paris shed, so scarce and costly it was treated as a national treasure. A world that looked at that endless glow and concluded, not unreasonably, that it must be bottled life. And then 2 decades in which people spread it on their faces, brushed it onto their teeth, soaked in it, swallowed it, strapped it to their bodies, and paid handsomely for the privilege, while young women in factory towns painted it onto watch dials and were told there was nothing to fear. Every other substance in this series had to fool somebody. Lead hid in the pipes and the paint. Mercury pretended to be medicine and magic. Asbestos disguised itself as protection. DDT was sprayed by people who believed they were saving lives, and largely were. Radium never pretended to be anything at all. It was not slipped into anyone's food or concealed in anyone's plumbing. Its radioactivity was the entire product, named on the label, priced at a premium, and demanded by customers who could not get enough of it. Eben Byers was not deceived into drinking 1,400 bottles. He was delighted to. The Ottawa women were lied to about the danger, but the world at large was not. The glow was the advertisement, and the advertisement was the truth. It went into the bone, in the millionaire and in the dial painter alike, and it never came out. And it is still there in both of them today. And it will still be there long after everyone who reads their names is gone. It was never hidden. It was advertised. If this changed the way you think about the old glowing clock in a relative's attic, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of Radium's story stayed with you the most. And share this with someone who has never once wondered what people used to willingly pay a fortune to put inside their own bodies.